Hey guys, this is Jim, K4YCD, and you're watching FEP Labs Radio. Thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it. So I want to talk about power and batteries again. We talked about this on Temporarily Offline stream last Sunday. We talked about this morning on Coffee and Ham Radio. Both Ape and T.O. did great videos. Ape smacked us with a lot of knowledge, and T.O. did some real-world testing of how much he could run out of a 100 amp hour battery. And if you haven't seen those videos, I'll put links to them in the description below. You need to go check them out. I wanted to run through how to measure what we're using. So a battery like this, and this is a Chin's, you can't see it, it's off the camera. This is a Chin's 100 amp hour battery, and it is also 1280 watt hours. And batteries like LifePos are rated in amp hours and or watt hours. And it doesn't matter which measurement you use as long as you understand how that particular measurement is derived and you have some way to measure it. Amp hours are not equal to watt hours. It's a slightly different formula. So an amp hour is a measure of how much current over a given amount of time. A watt hour is how much power, watts, over a given amount of time. So this battery supports 1280 watt hours or 100 amp hours. And you need to have a way to measure that. So you can measure it with something like this, a plain old digital multimeter, and these work great. Simply put it on the terminals and you get a voltage reading, and that's great. You know how much voltage the battery has. And at a certain point, you can look at that and determine that your battery is doing okay or it's getting sad. You know, that's fine, but this is a snapshot in time. So not super useful if you're out operating for some length of time. Another way to test your voltage would be to use something like a clamp meter, except clamp meters are mostly designed for AC household current, not for DC current. And the current may not be high enough to really trip the meter where it can read via the inductive kind of hookup thing that it does around the wire. So then our third option is for something like this, and these are these little inline meters. These things are legion across Amazon under various names. PowerWorks makes some on their site. I believe they're all the same meter, made by the same company somewhere, and just rebranded and sold under different names. So we have that kind. And we have this. This is designed more for the RC crowd, but it does the same kind of functions. This is rated for 100 amps. This is rated for 150 amps. So your mileage may vary. We're going to use this one because it's a little easier to see this thing on camera than the other one. So I have over here an IC706, and what we're going to do is we're going to hook our battery up to our meter here on the power source side. And then we're going to hook our meter into this, so our entire load that we use is running through this meter, and we can see what's going on. So let me get this hooked up, and we'll be right back. All right, now as you can see, the meter is powered on because we're hooked to the battery. Nothing else is hooked to it yet. This particular meter will do balance charging for the cells within your battery. We're not doing any of that. I don't have any of that hooked up, and this does other chemistries besides LifePo. It does LiPo and lithium ion as well. We're not fooling with those. We're going to use this for the watt meter function. I'm going to select OK, and now it's going to show us watts, amps, amp hours, and our nominal voltage coming out of the battery. So when T.O. did his stream, he had a DC set of wires coming off going to his power bus. It was a bigger one than this one, but for us this is all we need. And so he's running his DC over there, and then he hooked up a inverter and had AC appliances hooked into the inverter. And he had a kilowatt on that inverter, and he was measuring his AC watts and amperage. He didn't have any way to measure on the DC side. And since both lines were tapped simultaneously, the inverter was hooked into the battery there, and the DC was hooked in over there, both on the same posts with no measurement device. We really don't have a good idea of what the battery is putting out, how much amp hours we're using, how many watt hours we're using out of this battery. So the way to do that is to hook up something like this. And I don't necessarily recommend doing all of this the way I'm going to show you, but let me walk you through it, and your mileage may vary. Be careful when you're working with electricity. So we have our battery hooked up to our meter. We're going to hook our battery up to our little load block, our distribution block. So now we have our IC706 hooked into the meter and coming off of our battery. And so if I turn on the radio, and we're running in a dummy load, if I turn on the radio, you can see now that we've got some current. Oops, we've got some current here and some wattage, and it's showing the current amount of amp hours that we have drawn since this was powered on. Keep in mind this meter takes electricity as well, and the longer this is on, the more it's going to use. If you leave these connected, it will run down your battery. So you want to switch these or disconnect them when you're not using it. So with the radio on, we're using 1.4 amps. If I key the mic, and I'm transmitting into a dummy load here, KN4YCD testing 1 2 3 4, KN4YCD testing 1 2 3 4. So you can see we put out about 50 amps and used a 50 watts, excuse me, and about 3.5 to 4 amps of current. And that incremented our amp hour counter for that time it was keyed down, and it incremented our watts used. This is all great, but what if you want to do something like TO did and you want to run an inverter? So I'm going to show you how to hook that up. Actually, let me rephrase that. I'm going to hook that up. It's a very sketchy test setup. I don't recommend you ever use it like this in the field, but we're going to demo it for this video. Do not try this at home. I am a quasi-trained YouTube professional. So stand by and let me get it hooked up. Okay, this is our Bestech 3000 watt inverter, and I now have it hooked up. This is a very not recommended test setup or setup to run with. I've got house wiring, 12 gauge solid core copper, tied to a bolt. The bolt is clamped off on the inverter's inputs so we can provide power to the inverter. So we have the inverter hanging off this bus. We have our radio hanging off this bus. I'm going to turn off the radio for now. And we can see the current we're pulling and our cumulative cumulative amp hours rather over there. So if I turn on the inverter, you'll see that we're now at 15.9 watts, 1.2 amps, and 13.2 volts, which is showing us our voltage, obviously. And I have nothing plugged into this. If I turn on our radio now, you'll see that we're now pulling a good bit more current, and our wattage has gone up, obviously, because we're using more power. We have the radio turned on. We have the inverter turned on. Let me key up. KN4YCD testing 1 2 3 4. KN4YCD testing 1 2 3 4. About 60 watts and 5 amps total. But we're not running anything on our inverter yet. So now I'm going to hook up a load to the inverter, and what I'm using for a test device is this ghetto soldering gun, and I'm going to plug this guy into the inverter. And as I kick on the soldering iron, you'll see our current draw goes up, our wattage is going up, and our cumulative amp hours down here is going up. If I key the radio at the same time, KN4YCD testing 1 2 3 4, testing 1 2 3 4, KN4YCD testing 1 2 3 4, and then turn them off, and we drop back down to about 2.6 amps. This is the only way to really test our whole amount of amps that we're getting out of our battery, the total amount of current coming from the battery. If you test here, I'm pointing to it, you can't see it because I'm off camera. If you test here on the inverter with something like a kilowatt or an AC clamp meter, you're only getting the AC value out of the setup. You're not getting the true amount of current coming out of the battery. With regards to the battery, this is what we care about because this is what has a limited capacity. We're not plugged on house power with that battery, so we care about the total amount of electricity, amps and or watts, that we're utilizing out of the battery in our portable setup. So that is a good way to test it. My test setup is beyond sketchy. I have a bolt fastened to some 12 gauge wire for both my hot and my ground, and that's plugged in our little power bus. The entire power bus is the output side, the load side of this meter, so that when I do any of this stuff, all these things are coming off this meter. The only power input to this whole setup is right here, where we can measure our wattage and amperage as we're using our devices. So keep that in mind when you're setting up for field day, if you're trying to decide what kind of battery you want to buy, how big of a battery you want to buy. This is a Chin's 100 amp hour. This was about $550 when I bought it. Now these things are down to $350, a Redodio or a Ampere Time or Lee Time. There's 3 or 4 brands, and there are videos. Ape has done videos, Chuck has done videos, Temporarily Offline has done videos, and numerous other YouTubers about the different batteries. So you have a lot of options. The more amp hours you buy, the more expensive the battery is going to be, but the longer you can run with whatever you're doing. This is a really edge case setup for a portable operation. I have an inverter, a 3,000 watt inverter. That's not something you're typically going to take on a POTA activation or just operating portable somewhere, unless you absolutely have to have AC for something. If you're not using AC, then you can still use this setup, just minus all the drama here with the inverter. And I would not run with this setup the way I have it. This is just for testing and demonstration purposes. And as I turn everything off, let me shut off the inverter. You can see our current draw goes down, cut off the radio, and we're back down to no amps. And you can see here that we've used 0.3 amp hours out of our 100 amp hour battery. And that's with a little bit of keying up, that's with the inverter running, with the soldering iron off the inverter, so on and so forth. So there's some options. And as I said, these are, and I will find a link to these on Amazon. I think I'll find a link to these as well. This is a Hobby King. This may be a PowerWorks or some random Chinese brand, I don't know. But I'll find links to these particular devices and put them in the description below as well as some possibilities for batteries. Guys, that is what I have for today. I hope you got something out of this. If you would give me a thumbs up, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, ring the bell so that whenever I post any new videos, you get notified. And as always, make sure to watch Coffee and Ham Radios every Thursday and Saturday, and Temporarily Offline and I on Monday nights on Ham Nuggets, where we try to blaze a trail with something we've never done before. Thanks, y'all. Have a great day.